Hello, nerds. Welcome to another episode of the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Today we have author John Wood Sweet, who wrote The Sewing Girl's Tale. Disclaimer up front, everybody. This book is about a sexual assault back in old New York City right after the American Revolution. We go into that, we talk about it a bit, so if this is something that you don't want to hear about, feel free to hit stop. We'll welcome you back with open arms for the next episode. No worries there. It was a really interesting conversation. John goes into a lot of really interesting portions of the story, and I had a wonderful time. So I'm going to shut up. Let's let John talk. John, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, we're going to be talking The Sewing Girl's Tale, true crime story of New York City back in the day. I do want to, before we jump into that actual story, the dedication on the book looked interesting to me. It was for Elizabeth Wood Sweet, and you mentioned how she taught you how to sew. Who was Elizabeth, and how good at sewing did she make you?
So Elizabeth Wood Sweet was my mom. She died a couple years ago. She was a woman of remarkable positive energy. She had a lot of adversity in her life, and yet she was always resilient, which is one of the things I talk about. My favorite image of my mom is I was with my partner and her in Provincetown, and she was floating off of Herring Cove Beach where the water is cold. And she was floating like a seal, and she came back in. And I said, "Mom, how can you stand that water? It's so cold." And she said, "When I moved to New England 40 years ago, I loved swimming in the ocean. And I realized that if I was going to swim in the ocean, I'd have to get used to swimming in the ocean cold."
I love that, especially because Cape Cod, where Provincetown is one of my favorite places on earth. That is the target for me to retire, is probably around the Chatham area. But Cape Cod, it doesn't get better, in my opinion.
So she had 3 boys, but she did feel like we needed all to know how to cook and sew and clean up after ourselves. And I actually ended up learning a lot more sewing than just putting on buttons and fixing. I was actually insane. I got totally into needlepoint as a kid. So I did all these elaborate needlepoint things. I got totally into sewing. There was a point at which I was a big long-distance bike camper. And I wasn't satisfied with the different panniers that were available, so I ordered waterproof Cordura nylon cloth and made my own bike bags. And so, I did a lot of sewing as a kid.
Let's talk about The Sewing Girl's Tale, story of Lana Sawyer. How did you come about this story? What was the research like? Tell me about it.
I've known about this case for a long, long time, since I was a graduate student back in the 1980s, which was around the time Ms. Magazine first coined the term date rape. And it certainly was an extremely vivid example of a date rape from centuries past. And it was also remarkably well documented. It's a story of a 17-year-old sewing girl named Lana Sawyer, who in 1793 was raped by this aristocratic gentleman named Henry Bedloe in the back room of a New York brothel. And then, astonishingly, she went to the law to hold him to account. At the time, the trial transfixed the city of New York. It resulted as well in the publication of the first detailed report of a rape trial in American history. The story took place so long ago, and yet it seems so fresh, so modern, so shocking. And that was kind of how I thought of it, was as an historical example of the origins of modern rape culture. And I had friends who'd written about the case, and it wasn't anything I thought I would have anything to contribute to. And then, about 12 years ago, a graduate student I was working with, whose name was Maren Wood, uncovered a new piece of evidence that totally threw me for a loop. It called my assumptions about the case into question. And that was the point at which I felt I really was compelled to know more. And as I began to dig into the historical record, I kept finding surprises. The story didn't end with a rape trial, for example. It went on and became stranger and stranger. And over, as I looked into the past, what I found was the present.
And before we even get into even some of the actions and all of that, what struck me about the book is you make, to me, New York City its own character. You really go, and this is when you're talking about historical true crime, you kind of have to do that. You do have to reach back and say, people are not going to understand what life was like at this particular time. And you kind of vividly go into what New York City was like, who were the people walking around, for Lana specifically and women of that time, what it was like to walk down the street, whether you were walking with somebody, if you were not walking with somebody. Is that something that you were drawn to, that you wanted to have that vivid picture, or is it also kind of a requirement for this story to even understand it?
So yes, I really wanted readers to be able to envision the city as Lana Sawyer experienced it. I wanted to know for myself where she lived, the streets she walked, the sights and sounds she encountered in her daily life. But I was also aware that New York in 1793 was really different from the city today. Not that I, at that point, knew much about the city. In 1793, New York had about 30,000 people, not 8 million. And almost all of them lived clustered on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Pretty much everything above what's now City Hall was farmland. So one of the striking things about New York City is that while almost none of the buildings have survived from the Revolutionary period, there's a handful of exceptions. The modern city, nonetheless, is built on the footprint of the old. So you can walk the same streets, visit the same places, and some of the public open spaces have survived. So one of the first things I did when I started working on this project in earnest was that I walked the places I knew Lana Sawyer had been, trying to chart out where the events of 1793 had taken place. The spot on Gold Street where I thought her father's house was, where she lived. The route down Broadway she would have gone, on the walk she went on with Henry Bedloe. The Battery, which, is still basically the same as it was then. It had just been turned into an urban park in 1793 where people went to enjoy the views and the air and the breezes and the water. Their walk back up Broadway, past Trinity Churchyard, where actually some of Lana's family members are still buried, up to the side street off of City Hall Park, where the rape took place in the back room of a brothel. That site is now occupied by a luxury hotel, high-rise. And as I began to walk the city, I also wanted to figure out what these buildings looked like on the inside, how they were furnished, what the experience was, as you mentioned, like what the street pavement was like, what the textures and sounds were. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. It, in the end, produced this massive ArcGIS database. And what that did for the story was it allowed me to try to represent more cinematographically some of the scenes in the book and understand how intimate the city could be. It's really nobody lives more than a 20-minute walk away from each other in the story.
It's very hard for me. I grew up outside of New York City my whole life, just about 30 minutes away drive. And reading about exactly what you're saying, trying to visualize the gigantic city and realize, just like you said, just on the southern tip, and everybody's kind of really close. And then you could be on Manhattan and you're seeing miles upon miles of farmland. And those distances are really important to this story just in and of itself, right? It starts out innocently enough, right? Lana is on the street. Some guys are starting to catcall her. Can't believe that's still a thing a few hundred years later, but here we are. And this seemingly nice guy comes up and starts to help her. And that just starts this story in a direction that you wouldn't think. But the distances between these places is very important because, as you mentioned, it has to be intimate, right? Like this entire story is intimate about Harry putting himself in Lana's way and kind of not letting her out of her sight. And then even when the rape occurs, that it was only a matter of him taking her for a nice walk and then just taking her in the wrong direction at the last second. It just seems kind of insidious from the beginning. Is that what you were kind of feeling as you were putting this all together?
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways in which knowing where things took place and where people lived and the routes people followed helps me at least understand the story and visualize what happened. It's also important, I think, for understanding the relationships among the different characters. Figuring out where everybody lived was insanely difficult. I remember the first time I went to the main archive for property records is the Department of Finance offices on John Street. And I had been doing research in New England in these little tiny towns with like 500, 1,000 people. So like you ask for the 18th century records and the town clerk says like they're in that volume. And there's almost always a card index with the grantors and grantees' names. And so I went to the Department of Finance in Manhattan and presented myself, stood in line, waited for the clerk, talked to the clerk. I said, so I'm an historian and I'm looking for records from the 1790s. And she says, upstairs. So I try and find the staircase and I go upstairs and there's this giant room, this huge room full of shelves and shelves and shelves and shelves of bound volumes that made no sense to me. And there's nobody behind the desk. And I just was so deflated. I was like, how am I ever going to make any sense of this? And I must have looked particularly pathetic on that day because the one person in the room was a professional title researcher. As turned out, her name was China Williams. And she took pity on me and looked up from her work and she said, what you want? And I told her and she said, okay, let me show you. Go over here. Look at this. That's where you start. And then I was like, can I just hire you to do this for me? And she's like, honey, you can't afford me.
It's amazing how much research and luck goes into a book, right? You could write a 200-300 page book and it's like, oh, I read it in a few days. It was fantastic. And you forget that you had to go into New York City. I'm still amazed that the clerk was like upstairs. Like it wasn't first like, you're looking for what? What? Why? It's like, no, just go upstairs. So apparently you weren't the very first to ask, which I think that might help a little bit as far as the anxiety is concerned.
There's two things that strike me. One is like how much there is in physical objects. So you have to know what building to go to, what office to look at. And the other is how much over the time that I've worked on this book, how much many wonderful resources have been digitized. And so some of the sources that I turned out to be really useful in locating who lived exactly where were maps from the 19th century that were digitized by the New York Public Library just recently. In any case, mapping everybody out to the extent I could revealed a number of things that I wouldn't have expected to begin with about social relationships. I can just give you a couple examples, maybe. One is the day after she was raped, Lana Sawyer spent pretty much the entire day not going home. She was really clearly very distressed and distraught and traumatized. And then she went to visit an aged aunt who lived with another woman on the Bowling Green. Mrs. Bruce was the other woman who, as it happens, was Alexander Hamilton's aunt. It took a long time to figure out who this aunt could have been. And it ultimately turned out that her name was Rebecca Dykeman. She was a widow like Mrs. Bruce, who she was living with. And although Lana came from a very modest family, her father had been a carriage maker and died when she was 7. Her stepfather was a branch pilot. So she had a very middle-class family. But her aunt owned this big country seat outside of town and also owned the bakery across the street from where Lana lived. And her aunt's late husband, who had just died a couple of years earlier, had been an alderman. Seeing visually the property helped me understand that Lana had resources, inner resources, family support networks, access to a sense of entitlement that there was no way to predict that she had just by looking at her.
And it's important to understand relationships back then because I almost feel like the property stuff was complicated, but trying to understand, for lack of a better term, dating or courting back in the day and how that entire process involved everyone. I mean, you have a dating primer for this time period in the book where it's like, this is how it's supposed to go. This is what's supposed to happen. And if it goes off the rails, young woman can be ruined before she's even really started. Was that something that just came out of the basic research, or did you have to look hard to understand how relationships are supposed to work at this time period?
So one thing I can say about social relationships in this period, not necessarily dating relationships, is that everybody in the city lived pretty much cheek by jowl. The city was not segregated by socioeconomic neighborhoods in this period the way it is today or became in the 19th century. So if you were poor and rich people lived right next door to each other, and enslaved people and servants and apprentices lived in the household of the masters. So this was a world in which people interacted with others of different social statuses all the time. One of the crazy things I found out from doing this mapping project was some insight into the defense strategy during the trial. The defense lawyer spent a lot of time trying to disparage Lana Sawyer during the trial, trying to dismiss her as somebody who didn't matter, trying to dismiss the character witnesses who came up and spoke on her behalf as people who were so obscure that nobody even knew who they were. And one of the chief attorneys who did that in the ugliest possible way, saying that who are these people? We don't even know who these people are, was somebody who lived 2 doors down from Lana Sawyer.
It's amazing trying to wrap your head around society at that point in time, which, going back to it, this was a chance meeting on the street. Lana meets this guy. He seems nice. He's lying from the jump. Seems to take her out. Seems to be this situation where a young woman is looking for another young man who seems to have everything going for him. He's patient. He's all this stuff. He takes her on a date, keeps lying to her, ends up taking her to a brothel and raping her. And, you talked about how Lana's stepfather ends up being much more progressive. But, Lana's story before even getting to the trial is scary. She doesn't know that she can go home. She's afraid of what happens if she tells anybody, right? Because that's part of it too. She may not even tell anyone. And then even when she does tell people, and I love the way you do this, is you really ratchet up the tension almost every time she utters what happened to her. There's a chance that it can go horribly wrong, whether it's, telling her family, telling city officials, and then, going to trial and everything like that. Did you feel like you almost along this way were relitigating the case, right? Like that you were kind of putting those pieces together? Did you want to just kind of drop everything for everyone to put those pieces together? Or did you want to say like, hey, I want to make sure everybody knows precisely what happened here in no uncertain terms?
No, I can't say I felt like I was relitigating the trial. For me, it was pretty clear early on that Lana Sawyer's claim was credible, that Henry Bedloe was guilty as charged. And I found different evidence, pieces of evidence over time that supports that view. And I didn't think the reader really needs me to be heavy-handed about that. What I did try to do in the chapters leading up to the trial was leave, as you suggest, a sense of openness and possibility. It was not assured that Lana would go to law enforcement and file charges against Henry Bedloe. It wasn't assured that even if she did, the prosecutors would take her seriously, or that the grand jury would render an indictment. And as you point out, there are all these steps that happened even before that. Trying to understand her experience and evoke the stress and combined with trauma and family dynamics that she's dealing with is the question of what should she do and how does she evaluate what her best options are going forward. Part of the challenge for me at the beginning of the story was to help the reader experience that as the events unfolded, rather than narrating it as though everybody already knew the outcome.
And something else you hit hard too on this is all of those steps have to require a man in her life either taking her and doing it with her, right? Like she can't just, do what you do today. You can go right to the police. You can do all of these things. Every step along the way, she basically had to recruit partners to take her through the rest of the process. She couldn't do anything herself. And that kind of ratchets up the tension, right? Because every time she tells somebody, it's not even just, do they believe her? Do they believe her and will they do anything about it?
So you're absolutely right. Lana faced this whole series of mostly men that she had to convince and recruit as allies to her side. Ultimately, for me, I've concluded that her challenge was not so much to make them believe her as it was to care about her. And she was, I think, unusually effective in doing that. And that's a way in which she exerted real agency and helped shape her own destiny. Overall, I think that when Henry Bedloe decided to target and manipulate and ultimately to rape Lana Sawyer, he did so because he underestimated both her and her family. I think it's pretty clear that he assumed that, like most other victims of sexual assault then and now, that she would keep quiet. She would be ashamed and retreat into a kind of silence. And I think he assumed that a working class family like hers wouldn't dare take on a rich and well-connected individual like himself. But he turned out to be wrong on both counts. She turned out to have incredible grit and determination. And her stepfather turned out to be a fearless and relentless champion who, for a working class man, turned out to be amazingly resourceful in pursuing inventive legal strategies. But at the same time, as you point out, he, the stepfather, John Callanan, is a complicated figure. And I think at some level, he's a metaphor for all the other allies that she had to recruit. So after she was assaulted, Lana Sawyer clearly really wanted to go home. She wanted the comfort of her family, the comfort of her mother. But she was terrified of her stepfather. She had been out all night and she was afraid that he would beat her without bothering to listen to what had happened. And he himself was telling people during that period that she was away that he was thinking about kicking her out of the house. And other evidence indicates that he had an unusual reputation for violence. In the end, she did manage to get home in a way and to tell him what happened in a way that got him to listen and got him on her side. And then he turned out to be remarkably effective and a remarkably formidable antagonist to her rapist. There's also a way in which, by taking on his stepdaughter's cause, he also took a kind of ownership of it. And it raises the question of when alliance morphs into appropriation. In this story, that's not always clear, but it clearly is always a danger for Lana that as she tries to navigate the aftermath of this assault, that people who took on her cause might also take it over for their own purposes that weren't necessarily the same as hers.
I'm glad you brought that up. I remember that portion of it where you explain that this is so mixed up, right? She tells her stepfather. Her stepfather ultimately believes her. We're not giving away too much there. However, then because he has the power to actually take it to the next step, it's very murky because he's basically making two decisions, right? Because if he goes and does something about it, there's the question of will it work? But also during this time, it might have been best for him and even for Lana technically, because of the way women were seen no matter what happened. It would almost be better to cover it up, to just say it didn't happen. We're going to pretend this didn't happen. And that way the entire family isn't smeared by what happened and people talking. So especially when you're talking about him, first of all, Lana had to be extremely convincing. And then he had to be this special type of person for his time to say, I believe you, and then decide whether it's for his own self-preservation or, for Lana or both, to take this to the next step. And like you said, take it all the way. Because, we're still talking about the first half of the book. We're not going to give away anything in the second half, but this is all first half of the book stuff of the rape happening, Lana having the courage to finally say what happened, and then where the story goes from there. There's a lot of question marks about how this case could have gone instead of the way that it did.
Absolutely. I think one thing this story does is really vividly illustrate why it is then and why it is now that so many survivors of sexual assault, especially assaults involving acquaintances, don't make official reports of what had happened and instead keep a kind of silence. It's because the social costs of outing yourself as a survivor of sexual violence can be high because there's so much shame in our society around sex. There's so much stigmatization. There's so much second guessing. And because the options for legal recourse tend to be so unsatisfying.
Another aspect to this is if Harry is found guilty, he gets executed. I think that's another element to it, right? Is these days you're going to go to jail, but back in the day, if you were found guilty of this, you're dead. And I think that ratchets it up a bit even more as well, right?
That is one of the most, to me, astonishing aspects of this whole situation. The defense attorneys were the ones who spent so much of the trial saying the life of a citizen is in the hands of a woman, as though that's completely an illegitimate thing. And they kept emphasizing that his life is at stake, his life is at stake. And it's true that the official statutory punishment for rape in this period was hanging. And this case did provoke commentary about whether that should be the case, whether that was influencing the behavior of juries. And New York, in fact, changed the law to make it a prison term a few years later. But the fact is that even if you were one of the rare white men who got convicted of rape in this period, the chances were very high in this aftermath of the revolution that you would never get sentenced, or certainly never get sentenced to death. So if you look at what actually happens, even in cases where men are convicted, one case, the judge never entered a sentence. So he was convicted, and then the sentencing never happened. And that guy just was left to walk around the city and live out his life. And the others, 3 others I found, the men were pardoned for no apparent reason, not because they were innocent. So there's a kind of hyperbole in the discussion of what was at stake for the perpetrator in this case, because although officially the punishment would have been hanging, that was very rare for white men to be hanged for rape in this period. Mostly juries were convicting men of color and foreign men for rape, and those were the men who were getting hanged for rape.
I do want to jump. Alexander Hamilton does actually factor into this later in the book. Now, first, I want to congratulate you. Very often now, Alexander Hamilton is dropped randomly into anything that they can actually drop into it. But he actually does factor into the book a bit here. I'm just going to say it. I got the feeling you were not a huge fan. Is it because you hated the play, or were you not a huge Hamilton fan to begin with?
I don't know, Brendan. I like to think of myself as somebody who is not a hater. I try to love the sinner, even if I hate the sin. And to be fair, I found Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton completely engrossing. And I learned a lot from that book. And I love aspects of, and I really enjoy Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical. It's refreshing, it's fun, it's passionate, and a lot of it is just pure genius. At the same time, I've also read other stuff. I really liked Tilar Matzeo's biography of Hamilton's wife. And one thing that strikes me is that when you change the point of view, the picture you see changes. So for me, one of the things I thought was exciting about this book was that it gives us a chance to view the period of the American Revolution and the founding of the nation, not through the eyes of this little cast of founding fathers, but through the eyes of an ordinary 17-year-old. And people like George Washington or Alexander Hamilton show up as supporting characters in her story. And viewed from her point of view, they look pretty different. Hamilton in this book, I think I can safely explain to everybody, appears when he's hired by the family of Henry Bedloe to get Henry Bedloe out of a very serious pickle. Hamilton at that point had just returned to private practice after having served as Secretary of the Treasury in Philadelphia, so he had just moved back to Manhattan. And he was out to make money, and he was extremely effective. He certainly earned his reputation as a brilliant attorney. The methods he used in this case, I'll just say it, they were fraudulent and they were cruel.
Okay. Well, now people have to read it to figure out exactly what you're talking about, but we're not going to give that one away. Now, I know you have, and I don't know, are you still actively a professor? Because I'm reading your biography, professor of sexual studies. Are you still teaching classes, and are you going to make this required reading for your classes? I don't know if you're allowed to do that, but I'm just asking.
I kind of feel like this is a trick question. Are you trying to figure out whether I'm a hopeless narcissist or whether I'm suffering from low book self-esteem?
Neither. I don't know. I've never been a professor. I'm just asking. There is the view of a professor that they write a book and they're like, everybody has to read this book. I don't think you'd actually do that. But it is interesting to me, though, like this is something that really does highlight a lot of different things, right? The historical view of something like sexual assault and, like you were saying, acquaintance rape and things like that. But also, yeah, like can you make people buy the book? I don't know. It's just a question.
All right, what I'll say is one, yes, I am in fact still a professor. I'm not teaching at the moment because it's summer break, yay. But I teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and actually I just got promoted. So I'm now a full professor.
Congratulations.
As for this case, I've taught this case frequently over the years. Mostly I ask students to read the trial report. And I teach it in classes on the Revolutionary Era, on classes on the history of women and gender and sexuality, and sometimes in classes on the history of law. And in general, students find it engaging. They sympathize with Lana Sawyer. They root for her. They get angry. They feel her shame and her despair. They respect her courage. I think they really do see their own lives in her story. This spring, I had a wonderful group in my class on the history of sexuality. It was a small upper-level seminar with really genius students in it. And the book entered that seminar twice. First, I asked them to read one of the chapters, not so much to find problems with it because it was already in press and I didn't want to know about mistakes, but rather I was asking them to read it to open up a dialogue about the research process. I was kind of trying to lay bare my own process, how I decided what historical questions to ask, how I developed a research strategy to answer them, how I analyzed the results, how I tried to craft my findings into a coherent and compelling narrative.
So last question, and honestly, I think we've already answered it as we walk through this, but founded History Nerds United because there are people out there like history is boring. I don't need to read a history book. It's not going to have a good story. It's not going to have this. It's not going to have that. If you were talking to one of those people and they said, I wouldn't read your book, I don't like history, how would you respond to that? How would you convince them and say, like, this is why you need to give this a shot?
I think there are three basic reasons why you might read a book like this and why you might find this book in particular engaging and worth your time. First, I think it's a dramatic and engaging story that happened more than 200 years ago, but it feels immediate. I'm always struck as I was writing it and as I'm researching it, as I think about it, how shockingly modern it seems. Second, I think this is a window into the origins of modern rape culture, which is such a pressing issue in the moment. In this case, we see a gap beginning to widen between how our society treats sexual coercion among acquaintances, what we think of as date rape, and sexual assaults between strangers, which is sometimes called real rape.
I do want to emphasize that you are doing air quotes when you say it.
And I think finally, at a humanistic level, I think we read stories, both true or fictional, to make sense of our world and to understand the experiences of other people. So for me, this project has been about developing insight and empathy while also respecting the limits of what I can know. What gave Lana Sawyer the courage to stand up for herself? How did she recover from the kind of despair that she found herself mired in? How did her assailant come to think of himself as the real victim? This is a story with tragedy as well as triumph, but I also think there's a kind of solace. And I'll just close by saying that I was just talking to a friend earlier who said that the way the book is written, keeping Lana Sawyer's experience at the center of the story, keeping her always in focus, made the book feel for her intimate and intense. She said that she felt that the experience of following Lana's story, having it taken seriously, encouraged her to reflect on her own life and to, in a way, honor experiences of harassment and violence, some small, some big, that she normally keeps compartmentalized. I think we live with so much exploitation and harassment and with so much shame and silence. So maybe this book is an invitation to us all to take our own experiences seriously and to trust more in ourselves.
Well, John, I absolutely love the book. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode. Thank you, John, for coming on The Sewing Girl's Tale. I love this book, everybody. If you are into historical true crime at all or interested in it, this is a really good one to read. History Nerds United, please go out and find us on the web, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all of that stuff. Listen to all the other episodes. Send us messages. Rate us everywhere you can see. Please 5 stars. That would be nice. And let us know how we're doing. If you want more of something, let us know. We'll do it. We appreciate you. Until next time, nerds. Bye.